Hi everyone, and welcome to session 1A of the FemPond conference. And the session is called Querying the Census Data Collection. Without further ado, I think I will hand over to Kevin, who will talk about pushing on closed doors, queer data, evidence, and inaction.
Great. Well, hello everyone. First of all, my name is Kevin Guyan. I'm a researcher based at the University of Glasgow. And my work very broadly explores what happens at the intersection of data and identity. So I'm the author of a forthcoming book on queer data using gender, sex, and sexuality data for action, which is coming out in January next year. And much of what I'm planning to share in today's presentation is based on arguments that I explore in queer data, while also developing some new ideas from my current research into gender equality in the UK film industry. So when thinking about what am I going to speak about in today's paper, I kept returning to the metaphor of pushing on a closed door. Sarah Ahmed uses the metaphor of doors in her recent work on complaint and diversity work. And I intend to add to this metaphor by questioning the role that data plays. Whatever the weight of force trying to push open the door, when it's locked, it will only budge with a key. So to what extent can force or the weight of evidence present an alternative solution to the use of a key? For me, the metaphor of pushing on a closed door has implications for a feminist scholarship of data, as it requires us to examine how knowledge is produced, what types of knowledge, and what purposes does it serve. Crucially, this critical reading of data pushes back against dominant narratives about diversity in the UK, where energy focuses on changing exclusionary structures, and less so than establishing numerical headcounts. When presented as an alternative to equality or justice, diversity initiatives can have the effect of declawing more direct efforts to change people's lives for the better. So a census, for me, represents the most comprehensive example of a diversity headcount. And although there are many reasons to celebrate the collection of data on sexual orientation and transgender identity in the census, these developments are best understood as incomplete victories. So in my paper, I don't intend to go into too much detail about the design of censuses in the UK or discuss their failure to capture data on gender or sex that goes beyond the binary. Instead, what I hope to do is frame the census in a way that kind of problematizes some of the clear-cut arguments about the importance of being counted or the very need to count. And I think what's of particular importance to me is what happens at that third and final stage of data's life course, its use for action. Following the collection and analysis of data, the use of data is often overlooked. I therefore want to challenge the assumption in my paper today that more data or more detailed data necessarily improves the lives and experiences of those about whom the data relates. So one of the most common uses of data is to describe or to make sense of a problem. Problems under the umbrella of gender equality might include the pay gap between male and female employees, the absence of women in particular roles, the misuse of power and sexual harassment, or the experiences of trans staff. How problems are defined, what is brought into view, and how problems are understood as worth solving are not natural features of our landscape, but are the products and interests of those who already are in positions of power. So thinking about the relationship between data and problems, for me, invites two key questions. Firstly, what labor is required to undertake this work? And secondly, what stories are being told with this data? So I'm going to address these two questions in turn. Firstly, in terms of labor, I need to know the scale of the problem before work can take place to address the problem poses the question, who is expected to undertake this groundwork and at what cost? So to take one very recent example, the past few years have witnessed a stream of consultations in Scotland and across the wider UK on reform of the Gender Recognition Act, a piece of legislation intended to simplify the process by which trans people gain legal recognition of their lived gender. The UK government consulted on the issue back in 2018, alongside separate consultations in Scotland in 2017 and 2020, alongside select committee investigations in the UK Parliament in 2016 and 2021. You'll see the photograph in the top right corner there from last week, and that was on the same day the Scottish Government published the results for its consultation into reform. In the most recent UK consultation, although over 100,000 individuals and organisations responded, with the majority backing meaningful reform, in the end, the government decided not to act on this result. So in these examples, do we need more data about the problem? And even though a vast amount of data has already been collected, what, if anything, is the impetus for those in positions of power to actually do something about it? So writing more broadly on the question of data on racial injustice in the US, Ruha Benjamin has argued that the problem here is not a lack of knowledge, and that demanding data on subjects that we already know much about is actually a perversion of knowledge. By adhering to the demands of the existing system, minoritized groups are invited to accumulate yet more and more data about injustice, which involves burning through finite resources and energy to provide further proof of the problem. If we pause and think, what if this time, money, and energy were used in other ways? This is therefore very much a question about labour. What if this labour was spent on the development of mental health services, the provision of community-level legal support, or monetary help with overdue bills and rent payments? There exists a multitude of data projects that we could undertake related to gender, sex, and sexuality data. If every possible project was pursued, no time or resources would remain to implement actions to fix the problems that emerged from these studies. In addition, gathering more data on the problem when enough evidence already exists can contribute to the development of damage-centred or deficit narratives about the group under investigation. As observed in the work of Catherine Ignazio and Lauren F. Klein, data accumulated tends to focus on problems as removed from a more rounded account of people's strengths, creativity, and agency. This can do little sometimes to change the status quo for the better. And for Ignazio and Klein, minoritized individuals should not have to repeatedly prove their experiences of oppression are real. So for me, this begs the question, to whom are minoritized individuals and groups expected to present this information? For LGBTQ people in the UK, why are we expected to collect, analyse, and present data as a prerequisite for change? So as I explore more broadly in my work on queer data, information about LGBTQ lives and experiences are often intended to change the hearts and minds of a cis, heterosexual audience. Most LGBTQ people don't need further evidence of their marginalisation. The everyday experiences of inhabiting a body with an LGBTQ identity tells this story. The burden of proof is therefore required for a cis, heterosexual audience who may or may not take action depending on the quality of the proof provided. The presentation of data therefore functions as a means to convince others to do something. Returning to my metaphor at the start of the closed door, are we in search of a key to open this door, the stat, the testimony, the graph, the nugget of data that will change the status quo and make those in positions of power sit up and listen? Even if this data exists, which I'm pretty much skeptical about, our reliance on already powerful individuals and organizations to take action is very problematic. Principle 21 of the Feminist Data Manifesto highlights how projects intended to address inequity cannot rely on the goodwill of institutions to fix problems. The manifesto rightly highlights a missing step between the production of knowledge about the problem and the rationale for responding to the findings presented. This framing of data in exercises such as the census very much shifts onus from the quality of data collected to who or what is expected to listen and take action. It reminds us that even with the most robust, inclusive and need to counter the challenge, this might only enable us to push harder on a closed door. So I'm going to conclude my paper today by driving this discussion totally off course, away from the census, and towards my current research into how these themes play out in data on gender equality in the UK screen sector. So there exists a vast amount of documented evidence on the lack of gender diversity behind the camera in many sections of the film and television industry. Yet this evidence base has not necessarily translated into the implementation of effective interventions to address the problems described. Herman Gray asks, what would it take at the level of policy prescriptions, industry practice, and guiding assumptions for this evidence to matter in ways that would change the practices of exclusion they report? Efforts to address a lack of knowledge about diversity in the film and television industry, and therefore amass yet more data, can divert energy from changing practices that are known to be exclusionary. Clive James Nwonka surmises this misuse of data in his critique of the politics of diversity, noting how data operates as something primarily revelatory rather than something remedial. Responding to these challenges and exploring how data can open these closed doors is my ongoing focus. And I hope that this brief excursion into the world of film and television helps us draw connections between feminist approaches to the census data and other areas of work. So to bring this to a conclusion, reliance on the goodwill of powerful individuals and organizations to do something is an unsustainable foundation to build a data project. This critique challenges the possibilities of a feminist quantitative social science, as past investigations, whether into reform of the GRA or the UK screen sector, have demonstrated that the quality of evidence gathered does not necessarily reflect the extent of action that follows. Efforts to amass more and more data with hope that the brute force of evidence will push open that door requires getting more and more labour, often from those who are already minoritized and disadvantaged by existing structures. Even more insidiously, it requires minoritized groups to gather further data about themselves as being a problem, which can solidify damage-centered or deficit narratives. Rather than a force to produce something new, whether good or bad, data can also operate as a jam in the system that perpetuates the status quo and protects current ways of working. Although questioning gender as a binary variable will likely return more accurate data that better represents people's experiences, its use for action— You have 2 minutes, Kevin. Sorry. Its use for action still requires evidence to fall upon the ears of individuals who wish to listen and take action in response. So what I'm calling for here and what we need is a paradigm shift where we dedicate less energy to the production of knowledge about problems and more energy to the production of knowledge about solutions. I offer no guarantee that this will solve the complex challenges of inequality and injustice, but it gives us hope that we might find the key and no longer need to push on closed doors. Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for keeping on time as well. Okay, next we have Kirstie English with the title Reframing Census Debates, Essential Criteria for Representing Trans People.
Hi everyone, so I'm Kirstie. I'm a PhD from the University of Glasgow, researching how differences of sex, gender and sexuality should be represented by UK surveys. Today's talk It kind of follows on really nicely, actually, from Anna's keynote and Kevin's talk just there. So this is very much looking at data collection on trans people, kind of first off looking at the current census debates surrounding how trans people respond to the census in the UK, but this also applies to other surveys. And then it goes into a little bit of the data that I've collected. Now, this is very much preliminary findings, so take it from a pinch of salt, and it's based on an exploratory sequential mixed method research project that features 3 strands. First strand was a review of current survey practices in the UK, so that made a conceptualisation of sort of current practice, and it also identified overlooked groups. Second strand was engaging with those overlooked groups via focus groups, during which the people from overlooked groups got to co-produce survey questions that they felt represent them better. And then the final strand was an online survey of LGBTI plus people over the age of 16 in the UK, in which 347 respondents gave their perspectives on those questions, but also in survey representation as a whole, and also just shared some data about themselves as well. So, starting off, this will seem very self-explanatory to all of you. You're all researchers, you'll know this sort of stuff, but I think it's a very good and important thing to emphasise when we're talking about this issue, is when we design survey questions, we are not designing objective tools to capture objective facts from the world. Survey methods are always based on our own subjectivities and also the subjectivities of our respondents, who will be interpreting what we're asking for from the question. And given that there's a lot of assumptions involved, now that doesn't mean we should be trying to have no assumptions. Some assumptions, like the ones on this page, we should be identifying and leaning into. Other assumptions we should be trying to minimise because they limit how people can represent themselves as they see themselves. So these 2 assumptions here, first off, we should assume that our respondents know themselves and will provide information on how they should be represented. I'll go into a little bit on how current census debates kind of contradicts this a little bit. And then the second one that is really important to emphasise is that the estimates of the LGBTQ plus population produced by the census and any other population survey will be minimum estimates. This is true for any population that we collect data on, but will be particularly the case when it comes to LGBTQ plus people. So if we're talking about trans people in particular, the gender modality questions, as I refer to them, which is the language used by Florence Ashley, which refers to the relationship between sex sign at birth and gender identity. So basically, if you're trans or not, but not everyone uses that terminology. So those questions in the census, they will provide an undercount of how big the trans population is in the UK. That's not only because the question is only for people over the age of 16, it's an optional question, but also, people in the closet, some people might just see it as private information, so it will be an undercount, and that should be emphasised whenever we're talking about these numbers. So to address assumptions that I think we should be trying to avoid, I'm providing this question, which is the most commonly used sort of question in population surveys in the UK. So as I said, I reviewed surveys in the UK. I looked at 26 surveys conducted since 2011. That included the 2011 censuses and the newest round of censuses. I wasn't looking at the data produced, I was just looking at what questions were asked and what wording was used. So 23 of these surveys use binary sex gender questions. I referred to them as sex gender questions because most of them did not include guidance on or any clarification on what they meant by the term sex, which I'll go into as to why that's a problem. So the questions are normally, what is your sex, male or female? So key assumptions this makes. First off, it's binary. It assumes everyone falls into these categories. I am someone who does not fall into one of these categories, so it would exclude me. Secondly, it assumes that these categories are mutually exclusive. You cannot pick both. And it assumes that everyone has the same understanding of sex, which, given recent census discussions, we know is not the case. It also assumes that we all have the same understanding of male and female, or ones that is useful enough to have these as sort of separate categories in opposition to each other. Other assumptions aren't always made, but are sometimes made along with this data, are that they're static, so it's cis-normative. It would assume that everyone has this one box that they tick their entire life and it does not change. And that is directly linked to mutually exclusive biological categories. So this would be excluding the existence of people with variation of sex characteristics, also known as intersex people. And it just assumes that we're talking about some sort of objective biological fact, which as you can probably tell from my tone, I disagree with. But that's an assumption there. So how does the census address this? So since 2011, there has been guidance with they address one of the assumptions. They address the assumption that everyone understands sex in the same way. There has been guidance with the sex question. In 2011, the guidance is what we now know as live sex guidance. So basically it means that you respond based on how you live. So trans men would select male, trans women would select female, non-binary people like myself would just select whatever works best. Neither of them work very well. So then this is the guidance for 2011, also going to be the guidance for the 2022 Scottish Census. Documented sex guidance is also referred to as legal sex guidance. I don't use that terminology myself because it infers that there's some sort of legal distinction in this, but it's really just about documentation. In this case, it's about the documentation on your birth certificate or if you have a gender recognition certificate. So what this means is basically that trans people with a GRC can respond based on their live sex, trans people without a GRC cannot. And this table up here identifies what the problem with this is. So if everyone followed the guidance as designed, which they don't, but if they were, comparable trans people would be counted differently based on if they've a GRC or not. So this is an issue because one, we don't know who is a GRC or not, and it basically means, and we also can't ask like legally. I think that would be a major privacy invasion given the nature of the census, and I don't think we should ask either. And that's a very arbitrary thing to distinguish people on. And this means that the gender modality data that we've got then just becomes an estimate of how many trans people there are. It does not become an estimate of how many trans men or women there are. Small caveat is there is a text box that accompanies the gender modality questions. So if that was utilised, it could theoretically be used to clean the data in such a way. However, when we talk about like more aggregated data in the census, I'm not sure how much that's going to be shared. And it also, as any of you has worked with census data, you know that everything is separated in terms of the sex category. There's like how many, and it's always done via male and female. So it would be significant if we could have more accurate representation of trans people in regards to this. But the bigger issue here is that people don't read this guidance. As data users, we cannot use this guidance as a way to tell how people respond to the question. So in 2019, NRS, NatCen conducted research on like engagement with guidance, and even for trans and non-binary people who the guidance is aimed at, only about 25% read the guidance. So it's not an indication of how people respond to the question. So in my research, as I said, I engaged with overlooked groups and asked them about their perspectives on representation and survey questions, and had them co-produce questions that they felt represented them better. So these two questions here were designed by people who were overlooked in terms of their gender or gender modalities, so namely trans and non-binary people, but other labels were also used. I'm going to go through quickly what the benefits were of these question designs, because the benefit of doing focus groups with them is I've got to find out not only what questions they liked, but why, like what was the significance of these questions. So first off, tick however many apply boxes. This is important, as Anna said earlier, because a lot of these categories are not mutually exclusive. And if I move ahead, so this is data from my survey with 347 respondents. In that survey, I provided a question that was about the labels that they use, and it had an expansive list of options, and they could tick however many apply. So this is the results we got. The most commonly selected option was women. And I also have a count here of how many options they selected. This does not include the options of transgender, transsexual or cisgender, because a lot of people would have more than one option in regards to, so they would have an option of that and a gender identity option. So to keep it simple, I've just included the gender options, although some people do use like trans as like a gender term. But anyway, so this shows even amongst the sort of binary categories of man and woman, people are selecting more than one identity label. So it does not make sense to make them mutually exclusive. So going back to the question, there's also a text box included. The text box also does not include the option other, because people saw that as being quite othering and a sort of value judgment there. These are all prefer not to say questions as well. This is important because people saw disclosing this sort of information, particularly in regards to if they were trans, as outing themselves. So it's important that they have the option not to disclose that information. This is further enabled by the fact these are two separate questions. So if someone wanted to disclose their gender, but not their gender modality, they would have that choice. It would also enable intersectional analysis on, okay, so we've got women, and we've got women who identify with their sex in birth and women who don't identify with their sex in birth. And we can look at that, and we can also look at then other demographic variables such as ethnicity, age, disability, and look at how all these interact with each other. There's also, there's a language used here was identified as preferred by my participants. So sex assigned at birth rather than using the term trans. The reason they identified this as better was because not all non-binary people use the term trans in particular, and there's also a broader range of people who don't use the term trans. There's also there's some discussion about the whole sort of cis trans binary, not everyone falling within that. I wouldn't say that this is going to be the case for everyone. I don't think there's one objectively perfect question. I think that different questions work for different people. So this might not be the case for everyone, but it was what my respondents identified as important. Also, the options are alphabetical in order. This helps minimise sort of value judgments. It's not like certain options come first based on how important they're saying. They're just come first based on where they come in the alphabet. So that's useful. To sort of round off the potential benefits of these questions. So they kind of address those assumptions I was talking about earlier. And I'm not saying that these are, as I said, these are just questions that my participants designed. I'm not saying that these are objectively the best questions. I think there's a process. I don't think there is an objective best question. I think we should always be engaging in the process of figuring out the best way to represent our participants. But these questions here, they have some potential benefits. So first off, by actively saying that we are representing gender, it might address some of the questions surrounding sex. Like when we use the term sex, people, trans people in particular, this is not don't understand. They might question what has been asked for them. Then there's also the fact that by having more expansive options in a text box, we address this binary assumption. And if we pair it with the gender modality question data, we can have estimates not only of how big the trans population is, but also the gender demographics of that population. So that is what I consider a fully trans representative survey approach. And it's not, so it's full-fledged data on trans people. So as I was saying, there's not one single objectively correct question, but this is some sort of areas that we should be looking into for further investigation to see if they would potentially represent people closer to how they see themselves. And as Kevin was just saying, this is only one stage in a long process, and also one very so just about data collection here. It's not about analysis, it's not about application, and it also shouldn't be seen as an inherently positive thing. So this data could also be misused against marginalised populations, and that's important to note. Which is why having things like the option not to disclose are so important.
I have 2 minutes left.
That's fantastic, so I'm just about to round up. But yeah, I think that's basically everything I was going to say. I think that was very quick. I just dumped a lot of info on you. But yeah, my general research has been exploring my participants' perspectives on representation. They largely were in favour of being represented, but it was having that option of being represented that was identified as very important to them, not being forced to disclose data and having it as an option for them. And then when the option is there, being presented with options in which they can accurately represent themselves in terms of how they know themselves. Some respondents also noted that seeing their identity listed was quite a significant thing, and not just being put in a text box. But also, there is a lot of identities, so having a text box there means it's that extra little bit of security to mean that respondents can use that as well. So yeah, that's me. Thank you for listening, and I've been really enjoying today's conference so far.
Thank you so much. So we have Christina Parr talking about querying the census, demographic considerations of adding and changing questions on gender and sexuality.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So my name is Christina. I typically use she, her pronouns, but any pronouns work. I'm currently a postgrad student at Oxford studying sociology and demography at Nuffield College, and I'm going to be presenting on part of a work in progress for the first chapter of my thesis. And like Kirstie had mentioned before, any feedback would be very helpful given that this is a work in progress. All right. So the motivating question today for what I'm presenting is as follows. Through the census, how can we ethically and meaningfully capture hidden populations? And in particular, sexual and gender minorities, so queer individuals. And I really like this quote by Delane Compton, who wrote in 2018 about how a lack of inclusion creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. This quote, "We can't estimate the size of the LGBTQ population or build measures for reliability and validity because we don't collect demographic information on the population." So it creates this cycle. We don't know much about the population because we can't find the population appropriately throughout the census. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why being counted matters, but this has already been covered by speakers in prior. And in particular, the three questions that I get most often when I'm talking about this are why queer people, why now, and why the census? And I'll give the caveat raised by Kevin in the wonderful presentation prior that being counted is not enough, but I'll still argue in this presentation that data collection is still very important. Okay, so briefly, why LGBTQ plus people? Very briefly, whether the prevalence of queer people has actually increased or not, the disclosure, at least, of queer identities on the surveys has. So for instance, in the UK, the ONS found that around 5.5% of the UK population over the age of 16 identifies as non-straight or non-heterosexual. And for why now, we actually see that this is being driven primarily by younger cohorts. So in the US, for instance, Gallup found that 1 in 6 US adult members of Gen Z, so those aged 18 to 23 in 2020, identify as something other than heterosexual. And since censuses only happen every 5 to 10 years, depending on the country, beginning data collection now about these questions can mean that we can capture the burgeoning trends at a population level instead of just at a survey sample level. And finally, why the census? From a policy perspective, and so maybe going back to Kevin's point about actionable items, the census has many lasting ramifications. Thinking in the US in 2015, almost $700 billion was distributed to states due to census data. And this includes funding for housing opportunities for people with AIDS, Medicaid, food stamps, amongst other things. And LGBTQ people disproportionately rely on these programs. So without this data, policymakers can't actually have targeted interventions. And studying and counting queer people in mindful ways at a population level can therefore have a very lasting impacts on the well-being of the population at large, but specifically queer people. So for my presentation here and for the paper, I'm looking at 4 case studies to try to solidify some best practices. And in particular, I'm looking at New Zealand, Australia, the UK, and the US. And I chose these 4 countries for 2 main reasons. Firstly, I was interested in studying 2 types of interventions for queering censuses. The first one is on the top axis, questions changed, so changing questions. And on the left, we see questions added. I found 4 countries in which the same discourse about sexuality and gender questioning resulted in 4 different solutions based on combinations of changing and or adding questions. And secondly, I chose these 4 countries because we actually see a lot of interaction between them. Due to shared majority language on the census, we actually see they've been particularly influential in their processes. So news about censuses in one country often ends up in the media outlets of others. And we're seeing that right now about the August census in Australia. News outlets in New Zealand, the UK, and the US have actually covered the controversies there, which we'll talk about in slides to come. Because I know that not everyone might have the same background about all 4 of these censuses, I'm going to talk about them very briefly. I'm once again very happy to talk about this in more depth at any other point, but I'll start with the US because there have been no questions changed and no questions added for the US Census in 2020. There was just a binary sex question, which both Kirstie and Anna have talked about in prior talks. Many problematic elements about this that have actually been brought up in the US at a very public level, starting in 2017 with the Queering the Census movement amongst queer advocacy organizations. Essentially, the US Census Bureau had mistakenly published that sexual orientation and gender identity were proposed for potential inclusion on the 2020 census and had to renege that guidance online with a public statement later, starting kind of a public outcry amongst queer organizations and community members. So then I'll move to the UK. And once again, I know prior speakers have talked about this before, so I won't spend too much time on it. But we see on the UK census that there have been questions added, but no questions changed. So this is with the addition of a sexuality question, which asks about essentially gay, straight, or bisexual identities with the option to fill in others. And there's also a two-step gender question, which Kirstie just talked about in prior, about a what I think was rightly framed as a gender modality question, but is called a sex question on the census, and also whether or not this gender identity of the respondent is the same as the sex registered at birth. I'll also note that this census was particularly newsworthy with the High Court ruling in favor of the organization Fair Play for Women, which had argued that one's passport could not be considered proper documentation to validate their sex. And you can Google this after, and I can send literature on this as well. On the bottom left, we see Australia, which has questions, no questions added, but one question changed. And this was a sex question, wherein a non-binary sex option was added. I'll note that in 2016, the Australian census had tried to do more to capture gender diversity by allowing respondents to access a special form. However, with issues with data collection and likely heightened respondent burden, the 2016 census only counted 1,260 sex and or gender diverse people in Australia. And this has several problems of undercounting likely, and I'll talk about how this can be weaponized in potentially harmful ways moving forward, so why this is kind of a red flag. In the top left box, we see that New Zealand intends to have questions changed and questions added for their 2023 census. So New Zealand is one of the countries, along with Australia, that has censuses more frequently than does like the US, for instance. So after initially rejecting questions about gender and sexual orientation in 2014, New Zealand has recently, in the past year, publicly released new statistical standards for gender, sex, and variation of sex characteristics. And this guidance has actually already been implemented in many of their national surveys and is supposed to inform their census questions for 2023. Notably, the New Zealand guidance has been very explicit about how gender often matters more than sex for social scientific questions of interest. So this kind of like gender primacy approach. So this is just a summary table of what I was just talking about before, so you can see everything all at once. Australia has a sex question, but no gender question and sexuality questions. New Zealand is intending to change their questions and also add potential questions. The UK has all three, a sex, gender, and sexuality question, and then the US just has a binary sex question. So from this, I wanted to kind of solidify some best practices based on the challenges that all four countries have listed within their own rehearsal tests of the census, within their public statements, et cetera. And so what I was just trying to do was publicly kind of aggregate all of this into one place. So for logistical purposes, the best practice that I am kind of trying to summarize is on the left, and the challenges that inform it from the four countries are on the right. Many of these you'll see have already been discussed by folks in prior. So first and foremost, best practice and identity affirming approach, where a respondent can answer questions on the basis of self-identification. And this is crucial for both ethical and methodological reasons. And I'll talk a little bit about respondent burden. So for instance, trans respondents who were asked a sex question on the rehearsal to the UK census in 2021 were particularly likely to find the question, quote, unacceptable, irrelevant, and or intrusive. So just thinking about the tolls that it's actually taking on the communities that we're trying to collect data from, we should be very cognizant of the ways that we ask questions and the ways that this can be very triggering for some people. Anna spoke about this already, but some scholars have argued that sex questions are unambiguous, whereas gender questions are confusing and are problematic for data concordance. But in fact, research has shown that there's still error associated with recording respondent sex, as was the case in the GSS. And further, many trans and non-binary respondents, and this is what was mentioned in prior by Kirstie, don't necessarily know what's trying to be asked of them when they're forced to answer a certain sex question, which also introduces non-random error. Okay. And a second best practice is increased sensitivity and creativity with methods. So just trying to utilize a larger breadth of current survey tools to better capture identity. And I really liked the suggestions that were mentioned in Anna's introductory talk to this conference, but I will note that there are several other reasons why we might want to be particularly wary of sensitivity and creativity when it comes to the census. One of them is kind of the constant ongoing debate, especially between quantitative demographers in my case, about what it means to quantify queerness, especially when we're drawing upon queer literature that might be very skeptical of trying to put queerness into a certain numeric category. So this is a battle that we should always be kind of thinking with ourselves, especially for those of us who are data users of large-scale population level data. And I'll also say that there are many solutions to this, which is that we can try different question and response types. So things like the open text responses or continuous scales, such that we might be able to better reflect the complexity of queer identities, particularly in line with queer theory. We also would want to be very cognizant of survey-specific concerns. So things that already people have been thinking about, like question ordering or question wording or non-response. These are all things that we have to continue to keep in mind for methodological rigor. And so I provided an example here where the ONS was testing whether to put a sexuality or gender question first because of non-response issues. And they actually did find significantly different responses based upon which question was added first. There are also census-specific concerns. So in the census, for instance, the primary respondent is often the head of the household. This means that people have to be out to their head of household. And I'll also note that only those over the age of 16 in the UK could record their gender identity in the census. But we're seeing, like I said before, that a lot of gender queerness or queerness in general is actually driven by younger populations and younger cohorts. So in New Zealand, for instance, 2.5% of secondary school students in one study were unsure of their gender, and 1.2% of those students reported they were transgender on top of that. So this kind of just shows, like, 16 years old, head of household, these are census-specific concerns that we should be thinking about for data rigor. The final recommendation that I have is for ethical reporting standards, especially amongst us, especially amongst data users.
You have 2 minutes.
Perfect, thank you. And Kirstie already spoke about this in their talk prior, so I'll skip past undercounting a bit. But I will just note that those who are antagonistic towards LGBTQ rights might use small numbers as a means of justifying LGBTQ erasure. And I'll also note, especially coming from a US context, that the weaponization and or politicization of data is particularly prevalent in my mind, because census data has been used in the US and the UK in the past actually to target in particular immigrant populations. And this was the case for Japanese Americans in World War II, for instance. So my final remarks in my last minute here are broad, but I hope that they provide some takeaways for some folks here. I think that it's a priority to do these 3 things. Ensure inclusive identity affirming principles, especially for those of us who are trying to collect information on queer and marginalized individuals. Also to ensure methodological rigor, both across qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. And also have ethical reporting standards for those of us who are data users. And altogether, what this will hopefully do is ensure more inclusive policy interventions and data representation for studies to come. So I'll be interested in hearing everyone's remarks, and I want to thank everyone else on the panel as well.
Thank you so much. I will give the stage to Joe Strong, who has kindly prepared some discussion points. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Heini, and thanks so much, everyone, for coming along. And most of all, thank you so much to Christina, Kirstie, and Kevin for those incredible presentations. I'm somewhat overawed by just how brilliant all of them were. And I think I completely agree with you, Heini, that they were unbelievably able to speak to each other. So all the notes I was making, all the thoughts that I was having were kind of being answered as I went along by each presentation in turn, which was fantastic to see, and agreed that, I think it speaks so much to what we are here to talk about today, which is beyond the binary variable. And I think really clearly what came through in all of these is this real problematization of the ways in which we both conceptualize, undertake, and then use data, particularly quantitative data. And I think what was really brilliant about these three presentations is the way in which they spoke to really different parts of that kind of data commodity chain. So kind of what came across for me and what I was thinking about is really this idea of data performativity, which is coming through a lot in, say, global health research, which is, really speaking to this idea that a lot of the quantitative data that we collect is really designed to offer solutions to problems that are created by policymakers and sort of program interventions, things like that. And I think, Kevin, that came across a lot in the way that you opened this session, and the ways in which, how we use data, what the problem is represented to be, using that kind of Backy framework that Kevin, I know, came across in your extended abstract, really creates this sense of what quantitative data should we be collecting, who is collecting it, for whom, and why. It really strikes me, so Susan Erickson is a researcher who did work on data production in Sierra Leone, who kind of came to the conclusion that knowing people is not necessary. Increasingly, when we see the kind of harmonization of data sets, and increasingly when we see these kind of ideas of who needs to be counted and why, we realize that actually realities become far less important than simply just trying to understand populations as they are defined by the people who use the data itself. Those people who use the data, who then decide often where the funding is going to go, and of course, where the funding goes, the drive to collect more data goes. And I think that came across, thinking down to Christina, what you talked about in terms of why it's so important that we really grapple with these ideas of quantification, because there are these real tangible outputs, this real tangible funding output, these kind of really material things that for marginalized groups are incredibly important, but also who have very little control over them. So it was a really fantastic set of presentations. I'll go through each a little bit with some thoughts, and then I'll try and be quick because I think there will be loads more questions coming from attendees, and I don't want to take up too much time here. And I think what really brought these presentations together is this idea of counting, this idea of hidden populations, of marginalized groups, this immensely political nature of quantitative data collection, which I think is often misunderstood to be polite, and I think often actively ignored to be easy by data collectors, to be easy by data users, that what goes into a census, what goes into a survey, the questions we ask, who we ask, how we ask them, how we use those answers are immensely political. And it really struck me thinking about these underlying questions of counting hidden populations, marginalized groups. Who wants to be seen? And who are they being seen by, and why do they need to be seen? Being really fundamental questions. And I think that came across in all of the presentations we saw, is this idea of what is it that we're counting? Why are we doing that? And what does it actually mean to feel and to be counted? Which I think for a lot of us here, but also in general, we are potentially often the receiving end of being counted, but not necessarily being in control of that process of being counted. And I think that really kind of takes us to Kevin, the way that you really problematize this idea of what is it that our data are doing, and this need to count actually being sort of slightly antithetical to this requirement of justice that we have. That counting really responds to this problem of diversity that's created at the highest levels. We see this kind of diversity, equality, and inclusion, which often gets kind of reduced and pushed down into this idea of 50-50 and numbers, and not really taking this intersectional approach, not understanding this justice-based approach. That means that counting suddenly becomes important, where understanding actually the realities of oppression, of hierarchies of oppression, are reduced and are put to the side, then they're not of interest and they're not simply easy enough to look at. And I think that's really important when we think about this. And I think that tension that really came through in that presentation of this commodity chain, of who is using these data, why are they using these data, and the burden on the individuals and on the populations who are then tasked repeatedly again and again to keep having to express their marginalization and to make themselves seen and to be forced to be seen in a way that I think we never problematize the fact that there are lots of groups, particularly those within the center, who are not marginalized, who never really have to be seen because no one ever really, they're already seen by virtue of their privilege as central in policies. And I think we can really start to maybe turn and maybe quite queer this idea of hidden populations, of needing to be counted, of who is actually hidden. And it's the kind of unspoken hidden majority of, well, not majority, but privileged, if we think about cisgendered, if we think about white, if we think about middle class, who are hidden in the sense that they are just simply so assumed to be the kind of cornerstone, that central thing, versus who is constantly being told, you must be seen, and what burden that has on them. And one of the things I was really interested in, I think this pushing on closed doors was just fantastic, and I loved this metaphor, is really thinking about the kind of situation that research, the data uses in that commodity chain. And I loved, and I would love to kind of hear a bit more using that kind of backy approach in your work, Kevin, of when we think about what the problems represented to be, you know, what we have the data users and we see people are constantly pushed to have to express themselves or be seen or answer more and more questions about their burden of oppression. I think it would be really interesting to understand a bit more about what are they responding to? Why are they being asked those questions? Who's driving those questions? What are they intending to do with it? What are the end results? Because I think that's a lot to do with the fact that this is a commodity chain that reproduces itself again and again and again. And these questions, these ideas of counting are not coming out of nowhere. So what is the problem with us meant to be that we therefore need to be kind of counted in the way that we are? Or ask these questions, what is that being driven by? And I know that was something that you weren't going to fully go into, but I think it's so interesting and I think it's so generative, and that was brilliant. Which then kind of takes me on to what Kirstie you were talking about, which is, you know, then looking at the actual experiences of trans populations themselves and trans representation itself. I was super interested, and I'd love to know more about your methods in terms of the focus groups. In your extended abstract, you talked a little bit about focus groups being centered, one element, that focus group centered one element of sex, gender, or sexuality, and only featured respondents overlooked in that way. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about what that means. You know, how did you put together these focus groups? What were the dynamics? What were the kind of things interplaying in these creations of these questions? But I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I think it's super interesting in your work to hear that 20% of survey respondents stated they were never comfortable disclosing their sex assigned at birth. Only 51% thought sex should be represented in survey questions, compared to over 90% who thought about that gender should be asked. And I think, again, we really get this sense of whose reality is being constructed in these surveys, who is deciding these questions. And I think your work really tells us is that it is not trans populations, it's not marginalized populations who are being centered in the creation, in the questioning, in the wording of this work. And I think it really pushes us into a future of wondering about what happens if our surveys and our quantitative sciences recentered those groups. What if we created census and survey questionnaires and data that were designed by those on the margins, to which everyone else had to then fit themselves, to which everyone else had to then make themselves seen? What futures could we imagine in that case? And I think it really speaks to the fact that potentially the reason this isn't happening, as Kevin talked about, and I think as Christina then goes on to talk about, is the fact that these data are really speaking to particular users who will always see these groups as marginalized. And so, you know, whether being queer is quantifiable, but also whether we can completely queer the idea of quantity altogether, is something to kind of throw out there. And I thought it was an absolutely fantastic piece of research, and I can't wait to hear more, to have this kind of inclusive space that you created to allow this representation, to allow these questions to emerge. And finally, Christina, I think you really wrapped this up when you talked about these hidden populations and how we can meaningfully capture populations throughout, and why it's important to count, but also why it's important to go beyond counting, and kind of linking us back to what Kevin talked about with solutions. And I thought it was really great to look at the guidance and rhetoric of those 4 countries as you did, because I think it really speaks again to that performativity. What was it that all of those countries in that guidance were actually reporting they wanted to do? And I think your comparison with New Zealand, where they were very actively pushing against the idea that sex is actually the interesting variable, that gender actually is much more explanatory in a lot of the most important issues, is super interesting. It tells us a lot about the rationale, the mechanisms behind why adding in these questions. I was shocked. I had no idea that Australia assigned, when the data become public, assigned non-binary folks as male or female, if I understood correctly, which is just wild. And it tells us, again, a lot about who's using these data and what do they actually think about this? Why are they adding in these questions? What does it mean? And I was really kind of interested then in the way that data kind of takes on meaning after its data collection, linking back to what Kevin was talking about. I think all these presentations speak so well to each other. And again, you talked about this kind of methodological considerations, unpacking researchers who point to data concordance to point to some of the limitations of these changes, but actually asking the question of why should we actually care if it makes life a bit harder for us as scientists? What are data kind of purporting to be doing? Is it to make things harmonized? Is it to make things easily able to be analyzed? And what does that reproduce? What does that replicate? Who then remains hidden? And what does their push into being hidden mean? And there's that kind of dualism of populations who might want to be hidden versus populations who are made to be hidden. I think is really interesting, really pertinent. And again, I think, that searing question of whether queerness can be quantified. And if it can't, then what is our future? What is our solution with quantitative science and the current processes? I think is really brilliant. But one of the things I thought was really great to hear, Christina, from you is this idea of undercounting, which again came through with Kirstie and Kevin, the issues of ordering or question wording, I think of Laura Westbrook's work around sex and sexuality, the placement of these questions, how that makes
2 minutes.
Thank you. And this politicization of data, which again goes back to, throughout all of these, I think what came through a lot is this fact that we are a group made political against our will. Being queer is political. These are one, I think, cannot be queer without being political because of the politicization of our lives, and how quantitative data are deeply embedded in that political system. They are not separate from that. There are assumptions made there. So I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I think breaking this binary through these questions was fantastic. I think it would be so interesting then to see these operationalized, to get more data, more information, more understanding, as you had, Kirstie, of the experiences of people who answer these questions. So we have this kind of creation, the construction of the survey. We have them thinking about this politicization, the use, and how we can create solutions as opposed to keep answering the problems that other people create for us, but also this experience itself of what does it mean to actually be in the midst of these data to answer these questions? What does it mean to different people, and is that consistent? I think is a fantastic future, but overall, I thought a set of, complemented each other, but also I think, highlighted the complexity of marginalized populations. Do we count? Do we push further? Counting is important, but what are the limits? How do we ask these questions? Can we ask these questions? Is a survey the place to do it? Should a survey exist anymore? Which is probably going to make everyone kind of fall off their chairs, but what are we looking at? What are our end goals here? I think it really, these really complemented and spoke to those complexities. I'm going to shut up now because I think I'm the least interesting voice that will have the whole of today. So I'm going to hand over now, Heini, I think, to a Q&A, but otherwise, yeah, I thought absolutely fantastic presentations from all three presenters, and I'm just so grateful and privileged to have heard them.
Thank you so much, Joe, for this very insightful and very interesting discussion.